Hey everybody, Logan Zanelli here. This is episode 6 of the branding project, and if you haven't seen the previous videos, there are some links below so you can check those out so you know what we're talking about, where we're at. Today we're going to continue talking about creating the look. This is going to be part 2 of the branding, visuals, and style development. Last time we talked about color selection. This time we're going to talk about typeface selection or font selection. A couple things, just like color, fonts help you present the visual style of your brand. There are tons and tons of fonts out there to pick from, and each one has its own unique look to it. Even though some of them look very similar, and that's why we'll talk about this in a minute, grouped into categories, each one has its own unique flair that when used in a design or layout or any kind of marketing piece will actually either enhance or detract from that particular piece's style. Like I said, fonts are grouped into style categories. For example, serif fonts, sans serif fonts, slab serif fonts, decorative fonts, ornaments, which are like those little dingbats that you see, black letter, and finally monospaced. Each of the tons of different fonts out there fall into one of these different categories. So let's start looking at some of these. Serif fonts. Serif fonts have a very academic type of look, and that's because they're commonly used in textbooks. The reason for that is that it's a font that's specifically designed to be easy on the eyes. They're called serif fonts because they have those little tails and the little feet at the end of each letter. And when you have a large amount of copy, this type of font is used because those little feet along the bottom of the letters create a visual line for your eye to follow and make it easier for you to read the text. The next type is sans serif. Sans, of course, meaning without the serifs. It's more of a squared off kind of typeface. These typefaces offer a more clean, modern style to them. They're very commonly used in minimalist designs where the design focuses more on the type and proper typography. And the interesting thing about these is that these sans serif fonts can look trendy and high tech at the same time, which is interesting. So these are kind of an interesting category of fonts here. Typical fonts for sans serif are like your Arials, Helveticas, Myriad Pro, Futura, those types of fonts. Now, slab serif. Slab serif is more of a rustic, artsy kind of look, and it's really just a combination of the serif and sans serif styles. It's kind of its own unique animal. And the interesting thing is you don't really see it used that often. It's somewhat uncommon to see this font. I personally think it's just because not that many people know about it. But if you're looking for something that's more rustic and artsy, this is a good font choice here. Then there's decorative fonts, or decorative fonts, or decorative fonts. As you can see, there are many different types of decorative fonts. They're not good for large blocks of copy. You would not want to set an entire paragraph in one of these fonts. They're typically only used for headlines and decorative text, which is why they got their name. Fonts that you find in this category are things like script fonts, handwriting fonts, very styled artistic type fonts like you see here, and so forth. Now, ornaments are basically clip art fonts. They're comprised of little pictures. Typically they're used as embellishments. For example, instead of using a dot for a bulleted list, you'll use a little ornament font for that bullet to create like a little picture, like a check mark or a arrow or a star or something instead of a bullet. And the other thing is, obviously, they are not readable. As you can see here, this particular layout of these 4 little pictures here, that is actually the word font, and you can't obviously read that. So that's just a brief overview of the ornaments category. Then we get into black letter. Black letter is more traditional Gothic style fonts. They are typically very commonly used around Halloween time because they're kind of spooky looking, kind of that Count Dracula kind of look. They are also very common in rock and roll. You'll find a lot of rock and roll bands use this type of lettering in their logos and in their album names. But the interesting thing about some of them is that they are very difficult to read. Some of these more calligraphy style typefaces can be very difficult to tell if you're looking at the letter Z or the letter J. So something to keep in mind if you decide to use a black letter font. Make sure that you choose one that all of the letters are readable. And then finally we've got monospaced fonts. Monospaced fonts are old school. This is back from when we had good old DOS and nothing else in the computer world. And there wasn't much choice in fonts. It's interesting that there are also several styles of monospaced fonts. They're not all typewriter looking like this. There are some that are serif, there are some that are sans serif. What makes them monospaced is that they have a single spacing setting between the letters, meaning that the letters do not line up as closely as other fonts. There's a gap in there, and that gap is set at a single setting for each and every letter, as opposed to each letter having its own unique setting. These are very rarely used. You very rarely see fonts like Courier, for example, being used for type unless there is a very specific reason for it. So that is an overview of the monospaced fonts. So, like I mentioned, there are thousands upon thousands of fonts to pick from. I mean, there's just absolutely tons of them out there. Each one is uniquely different. Some of them, even though you've got thousands of different serif fonts, each one has its own unique flair and letter styling, which adds to the overall visual style that font helps create. And even though there are thousands and thousands, like I said, they all fall within one of the 7 categories in the previous slides. And of course there are more being added all the time. There are artists creating fonts even as we speak and adding them for purchase and for sale, and it's really quite interesting to see how many different variations of those 7 categories font-wise are out there. There's tons of different fonts. There's so many of them out there. For example, if you look at a serif font, it is sometimes hard to nail down exactly what font it is, because it could be Garamond, it could be Times, it could be Palatino, it could be New Baskerville, it could be any of them. So you have to look very, very closely at the individual style of each letter to be able to tell which font it is. I recommend that you choose at least 2 fonts for your brand, one for your main paragraph copy and one for headlines or decorative style text, as we looked at before. The reason for that is it gives you more design flexibility and allows you to do more visually interesting looks with your individual brand. Now, one thing that I will caution you on is do not use any more than 3. 3 is the limit that you want to stick to, and that is because if you start using too many fonts, it actually makes the design look very mishmashed and very busy, and it will actually cheapen the look of your brand. So choose at least 2, but no more than 3 for your particular brand. So, where do you find them? Well, this site here is one that I buy my fonts from. It's myfonts.com. And you can see here that there are fonts that are fairly cheap. Now, I know you can't probably see it very well, but there's actually a little field where you can type in sample text. For example, let's say you wanted to see your own name, like I have my name here, and a particular font. You can actually type that in, and it will show you your name or whatever text you put in those specific fonts. You can get an idea of whether or not it's going to work for you. This is the website that I buy most of my fonts from. However, there are tons more like it. There is, fonts.com, and there's just tons of them. So even though this is the one that I tend to use the most, certainly look around because there are tons of them out there. Then there is also specific artists who create these fonts have their own website. For example, this is the website Legacy of Defeat. It's by Hydro74, and this is one of my favorite artists as far as both art and fonts. Again, that's legacyofdefeat.com, and as you can see here, he has quite a few fonts that are up for sale. So you can sometimes find fonts directly from the artists themselves. So let's talk a little bit about Chic Startups and what we're going to be doing with that. Last time we talked about the color selection we're going to pick and how we're looking to create a clean corporate look but something that's also modern and stylish. So in this particular case, because I want a clean corporate looking site, but that also has that little bit of chic, stylish, smart, sophisticated kind of look, I'm going to end up picking a sans serif font as the primary font style. And then as far as the individual font themselves, for any graphics or print work, it's going to be Myriad. And for web stuff, it's going to be Lato, which is Myriad's web counterpart. And you can find that Lato font. It's just the Google Web Fonts API. But that's what I'm going to end up doing for that. And that will complement our color scheme very well. And you'll see that in an upcoming video when I start showing how I've put some of this stuff together. So that pretty much covers the typefaces tutorial, I guess you'd call it. You could certainly go through and pick out your own typefaces now using myfonts.com or doing searches for individual font artists and so forth. Now you know a little bit more about the different styles of fonts and what you can accomplish with them. Again, this is Logan Zanelli from loganzanelli.com. And if you haven't done it yet, make sure you put your name and email address in the form below to be kept up to date on this project and also be notified when the new site goes live. We're getting pretty close now, and I would expect that the new site should be launching in a week or so. So that's it for now, and I will talk to you soon.